Greetings. This video is going to pick up on some ideas that Barbarossa talked about in his video on language. I wanted to make a response video, but I won't be covering everything, and I will be going off on my own path here a little bit with respect to speaking of language. As many of you know, language and formal linguistics is actually a background of mine, and so I think I have a fair amount to say about it. That said, though I have studied the philosophy of language, it was never my primary interest nor my primary sphere of study. So for the most part, I'll be concentrating on the more anthropological, sociological, evolutionary aspects, as well as the formal linguistic aspects. Many things to talk about. To begin with, one thing that is a very common belief is that we think in language. Many of the people in the comment section, Barbarossa himself, thinking in Spanish versus thinking in English, or thinking in French versus thinking in English, and so on and so forth. This is in large measure actually an illusion. The illusion is created, of course, because we speak to ourselves in our heads. Now, most people conventionally categorize that as thought, when in reality it's not. Thinking is obviously a much deeper neurological process. The firing off of neurons, the connections between the synapses, etc. Everyone engages in that, and we have to assume that the processes that occur during this thinking process, the underlying processes, must be identical more or less between human beings, otherwise it wouldn't work. And furthermore, the thinking that leads to active thoughts of language in the head, such as at one moment you're speaking in your mind in Spanish and then in English, none of that would be possible without the underlying processes. And so what people in linguistics tend to focus on is universality and the underlying processes behind things. They use tools to do this. For example, in formal syntax, and sometimes to a lesser extent in semantics, they use what they call syntax trees. In a way, they're quite similar to mathematical proofs. They take all the evidence and exclude possibilities and narrow it down. So thought itself is unrelated to language. However, it could be argued, and I think there's evidence for this, that our only means of reiterating those thoughts, these means tend to be limited to some form of language, whatever that language might be. So the thoughts might be there even independent of language, but without language, we often speak of the limiting factor in reproduction in mating strategy or evolution. Look at language as the limiting factor in thinking. It is not thinking. It is not thought. But without it, the thoughts and thinking itself could likely find no expression. But the important thing here, of course, is not that so much as, because it's merely a means to an end, language, with regards to thought, the Spanish, the English, the French, whatever, Hungarian, whatever those thoughts might be in, are quite superficial and secondary to the thoughts themselves. Now, what language then does is it serves as a limiting factor, as I said, but more importantly, as a filter, right? So whatever language is being spoken by, given person X, if you will, the language will apply its seemingly unique, and we'll be touching up on the idea of seemingly unique features, salient features, its syntax, its morphology, etc., as well as its own lexis, to effectively pronounce those thoughts to the world. And the end product, of course, of thoughts, right, is not thoughts, but language, which is to be differentiated here. It's a little bit tricky. I'll repeat myself. The end product of thought is not thought, but language. language being the limiting factor, that filter, right? So it is a bit complicated, the issue. It's a bit tricky, but it's not transparent. The conventional wisdom that we think in language is simply not accurate. We filter things in language. It is a filter, a limiting factor in how we communicate thoughts, but thoughts themselves do exist independent of language, even if those thoughts are highly minimalist and even primitive in some cases. So that is a point of confusion, not so much contention. And another point to cover is, does language influence the way we perceive and think about the world? Now, this is more or less well codified in, or the idea, the hypothesis, in this famous Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Anthropologists, at least one of them, I believe Sapir was, I might be confusing, it's been a while, who came up with the idea after studying Amerindian, that is Native American languages, that some languages are so different that they fundamentally alter one's perspective of reality. Okay? It was well accepted for quite some time, and later on it branched off into a strong version of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and a weak version. The strong version being pretty much the original one, that whatever language you speak, that's going to completely alter your perception of reality. The weaker one being some aspects of perception might be affected, but nothing to the point where it's so differentiated from speakers of other languages that it's even worthwhile accounting for. So I mentioned in the comments section that this was years ago. They performed some experiments with Korean speakers and Japanese speakers, and it turns out that they had a slightly different interpretation of geometric objects, but from, say, an English speaker, different from an English speaker, but not to the point where, say, either group, English speakers or Korean Japanese speakers, were actually impaired in their ability, say, to perform geometric tasks, right? They would describe things slightly differently, maybe, but nothing resulted from this. There was no real consequence. And generally speaking, that is the consensus these days, the weak version of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And this has been around for almost 100 years. They came up with this in the 1920s. Is generally more accepted than any strong version. That is to say, yes, language has a minimal effect on how you perceive things, but the fundamental things such as, Barbarossa actually suggested, or he posed the question, he wasn't suggesting this, do Chinese code makers look at things differently? Well, the answer to that is, in all likelihood, in highest probability, they might very slightly look at things differently, but the end result is the same, and nobody is going to interpret, say, computer code any differently, be they English speakers, Italian speakers, Chinese, or whatever. So that's generally the consensus, that one, language is a filter for thought, but not thought itself, and so no one is actually thinking in a language. It's just being the limiting factor in communication, and the final filter. It's the only way we can access things, and so we're using that limiting factor and describing the thoughts we have, even though those thoughts themselves are abstract and independent of a language, and indeed independent of the syntax and constraints of said language. That's the final product, the end product. Language is not synonymous with thought. It is the expression of thought, but they are not the same thing. And, of course, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that has not been debunked so much, has been highly weakened and minimalized. Most people don't subscribe to it. There are apparent exceptions that I'll get to in a bit, but the example I want to cite is someone posted a link to Psychology Today where they took, I believe it was Spanish and German speakers, and they did experiments in the way they describe various objects, bridges and what have you. And of course, in Spanish, bridge being masculine and German being feminine, supposedly the German speakers described the bridge and its structure as a sort of female entity, allegedly, and the Spanish people as a more masculine. Now, I don't know what the sample size was. It sounded very small, the amount of people who did this, but there's not much credibility to this. One comment that was made is that gendered languages, that is, languages that have categories that are in grammatical terms classified as gender, oftentimes it has, most of the time, in fact, nothing to do with natural categories of gender. And some of you might be a speaker of a gendered language, a native speaker. If you're a German speaker or a Spanish speaker or a Romanian speaker, some of you may not. Hungarian is not gendered, and modern English is not, nor any Eastern languages, or very few. Chinese is not, Korean is not, Japanese, etc. That this gender and grammar is somehow reflective of a worldview or world categories and what have you. I didn't see that evidence in what was presented to me, and it seemed really weak with using certain words to describe things. In German, which has three genders, I speak several languages, so the German is without a doubt my strongest. It is a language that has three genders, and yeah, native speakers and near native speakers such as myself, we don't think of, when using grammatical genders, this sort of embodying anything. There are many nouns in German that happen to be feminine that have, well, frankly speaking, nothing to do with being feminine. For example, the word for newspaper, die Zeitung. When I can assure you, when I say that, and certainly native speakers of German say that, we're not thinking of die Zeitung as a embodiment of femininity or anything like that. And the same is true of abstractions. For example, die Weisheit, wisdom. Now, you could argue that wisdom is then what personified as a female, but nobody actually thinks that. And indeed, in Old English, wisdom was actually a masculine. Se wisdom. Se wisdom was a masculine. Remember, Old English used to have three grammatical genders as well. So did Old English people think of wisdom as being personified as a masculine? No, these were just components of the language, essentially, bits and pieces. It has nothing to do with actually thinking in gendered categories, although some people would like to convince you of that. This is just another kind of piece of folk wisdom, I think. Or more often than not, it's speakers of non-gendered languages such as English who tend to ascribe these things to native speakers of languages with a gender. And honestly, it's a bit odd because, say, take a language such as Dutch. I mean, within the European context, you have, say, languages such as Russian or German that have three distinct genders, grammatical genders. Languages such as Spanish and French, which only have two, masculine and feminine. And then you have languages such as Swedish and Dutch, which have a common gender, which is sort of a composition or compiling of masculine, feminine, and a neuter. And this harks back to an older age when they all had all three gender categories, but they've been fused together. What does that mean? Does that mean that a Dutch speaker who is talking about cheese, de kaas, does he think of cheese as a amalgam of the feminine and masculine, whereas a German, der Käse, thinks of cheese as being absolutely masculine? I mean, et cetera, et cetera. My point is that these categories really have nothing to do with actual perception of things, and it's for the most part just a fanciful, wishful thinking on the part of English speakers, or indeed any speaker who doesn't have a gendered native language. There are exceptions, it seems. One man back in the 80s, Daniel Everett, a talented linguist, both in the formal sense, he was a formal linguist as well as a talented person at languages, studied a language in the Amazonian rainforest called Paraha. Now, many things were discovered, and this language was said to break many of the rules that Chomsky had proposed, rules that are encapsulated in this term minimalism, for describing a universalist approach and a universalist descriptive model of language. I'll give you some examples. And Paraha has no terms for color other than just light and dark. You look at red, we might say dark red, English speakers, light red. They would just say it's dark or it's light. And particularly in the case of Paraha, they really don't have any concept of numbers at all. It's just many. You know? So this seemed quite baffling. And if you remember in Escape Velocity, I actually talked about this concept of recursion. And we know that recursion is also a property of mathematics, right? And it's certainly the property of apparently either every language or the vast majority of languages, because recursion is what allows us to create all these embedded clauses. Even as I'm speaking, I'm engaging in recursive processes because there we go, because that is a clause dependent on the last one, and I will follow up with another clause and so on and so forth. That's recursion in language, this linking, right? Apparently, that doesn't exist in Paraha. I am not an expert. In fact, I don't even know one word of the language. I've just read up on studies and what have you. Now, the biggest clue to the possibility that Paraha represents a non-recursive language is that they cannot perform mathematical activities. This was quite fascinating what they did. Now, engaging in sort of anthropological research, this man, Daniel Everett, was trying to engage in trade with these hunter-gatherer tribe, right? I'll give you this for that. And they found that the Paraha tribes people found that they were constantly being what they felt as they described as being cheated, and this man Daniel Everett, this linguist, was winning out over them. And so they said, no, we want to learn this counting that you keep on doing. He spent 8 months nonstop trying to teach these Amazonian peoples the fine art of counting, which ultimately resulted in failure. They could not learn to count. Apparently, they couldn't even learn that 1 plus 1 equals 2. The concepts just seemed foreign. And the hypothesis that Daniel Everett proposed for these Paraha-speaking people, was that it was partially cultural, or mostly cultural, and simply it didn't come into play because they never needed it, being hunters-gatherers. That might seem really foreign to us, and indeed, a language that does not display even a significant range of numerals seems to most people counterintuitive. And Daniel Everett claims that this destroys the idea of universality of language. I'm on the fence. I don't really know enough about Paraha to say otherwise, only that something like 99.97% of other languages do. There might be exceptions to the rule. We don't actually know. But I do want to offer a different interpretation of this. There are many languages in the world that have a limited numerical system, counting system. And indeed, Paraha is exceptional in that apparently it has no numbers beyond just many. But there are tons of languages, particularly in Aboriginal Australia, that really only go up to a certain point. And I don't know the exact details of these Aboriginal languages. I'm not an expert in Aboriginal languages. But we know that at some point in time, it trails off into many. You might go up to 80, and then it goes into many. And indeed, in the Korean language, it's rather infamous that the native Korean numbers only go up to 100, and after that, you have to use Semitic numbers, that is Chinese numbers, to do the counting. And that's really interesting because that would point to, at some point in time in the history of Korean, they probably only went up, and this was thousands of years ago likely, only up to 100 at some end. The Chinese numbers took over that function, or rather took over the absence of the function. And this day you can actually talk about all sorts of numbers in Korean, only that once you go past 100, you're pretty limited to Chinese numbers. So it's not a completely unknown phenomenon. And I'm going to propose, sorry, I'm a bit hoarse, I'm going to propose that even English has this sort of concept or conceptualization. So hear me out. There reaches the point in the mind of an English speaker, indeed any modern speaker, any modern language, East or West, that the numbers we use to represent actual counting objects, pens, coins, whatever, or even inventory, that they cease to be representative and they become complete abstractions that we could never ever conceptualize or visualize. And I can give you a perfect example. Numbers such as quadrillion, quintillion, sextillion, septillion, octillion. Now, of course, you can still engage in mathematical processes. You could multiply those numbers and come up with some abstraction going, the gods only know how far up, for which you would use a Latinate prefix to describe it, and probably whatever convention would dictate. But I'm going to argue that none of us really knows what that means, quintillion. I mean, quintillion coins on the table. What is that? Well, we know what it represents in theory, but none of us can conceptualize it or envision what that actually entails. Now, you might argue, well, if we had at least so and so many coins on the table, we could create a picture and then we could sort of multiply that. But no, none of us. Quintillion, none of us really knows what that means. Means in the context of actual representation of real objects. And I think I see this as an extension of our many. I mean, at some point in time, say quadrillion, quintillion, sextillion, septillion, so on, that's a form of our many, right? What the Paraha have, for 2 upwards, apparently. This we go a little bit further, and then we have these numbers which seem to represent something, but honestly, none of us can actually describe what quintillion means in terms of representation of real objects. And thus counting, I mean, we wouldn't even use those numbers to count. Maybe in the future we will. Maybe that will change things. But I also see this as a kind of selection pressure. I mean, language in its development tends to evolve as a function of selection pressure, in the same sense that biological organisms do and their genetic components do. Pressure is put upon them. They are subjected to pressure, and they will either fold or in the vast majority of cases, they will adapt in some way, shape, or form. Now, languages that are incorrectly termed as primitive, say Aboriginal languages of Australia or Amerindian languages, all of these languages have some idea that can vaguely represent the concept of some more modern words that we would use in Western or Eastern languages to describe things. I mean, for example, computer. There are words in languages that probably would not fall too far from the description of computer, at least in a very abstract sense. So it's just a question of exposure and developing these things. And this falls in line with the idea that Daniel Ever was proposing, that they just never needed, the Paraha never needed to count. And if it's not needed, you're not going to develop it. Antelopes don't have sharp incisor teeth because they never needed it. They are herbivores. So this, to me, is once again a sign of universality. That is to say that all languages, all people have the potential to incorporate concepts and develop. There was a time when Italian had no lexis whatsoever to describe modern computing. Now it does, and the same is true of almost every European language. These are selection pressures, and the languages respond by creating new lexical items, and depending on the context, it might even create new syntactic rules or what have you. In fact, or rather indeed, you can look at most change in language at the structural level as a consequence of selection pressures. If language is somehow related to communication, and I think it is an important part of why language is there, then undoubtedly the more streamlined communication is, the more it's likely to be subject to or rather the subject of selection pressure. And it's going to respond in much the same way an organism will, by streamlining its processes and what have you, or becoming adaptive. I'll give you a perfect example of this. I have noticed, having lived outside the United States for 20 years now, that I speak a very different English from the modern lingo, and I'm not just speaking of generations, although it is in large measure a generation. I notice, for example, that certain forms, which having grown up with a certain form of English, and even to this day, that I would deem in traditional linguistic terms as ungrammatical, they just wouldn't make sense to me, are not only grammatical but used incessantly. I mean, I have to overcome the prescriptivist in myself because I hear it in videos across the world. This is the infamous "there's" construction, right? There's cars in the parking lot, or there's lots of examples. This, to me, even to this day, is ungrammatical. I would never say that. I would say there are or there as a contraction. But for most modern Americans and possibly other, well, actually Australians as well, it seems, based on my observation, this "there's" construction is perfectly fine. Now, technically speaking, if someone were to criticize it, the problem with it is, and you have a "there is" and then you follow by a plural, you don't have what we call agreement with the copula, which is the verb to be. But even "there is," it seems, is grammatical. "There is cars in the parking lot," or "there is lots of examples," is not completely ungrammatical in modern English, and indeed in apparently some varieties of Australian English. Now, we can look at this as a streamlining process. French indeed has this as well. Those of you who know French know the construction "il y a," which is obviously a combination of the verb to have and some particles. There's no distinction between a singular or plural. Il y a une voiture or il y a des voitures. There is a car or there are cars. It's all the same thing. And so this is obviously a streamlining, and in much the same way a biological organism would respond to selection pressures, right? I, on the other hand, have been outside of, say, the American English environment for quite some time, and so I've not been subjected to those selection pressures, and so this mutation, if you will, or this change didn't take place. And the same can be said of any other changes that take place in language. Language responds to a number of selection pressures. Many of them are socioeconomic, many of them are just social. And if the purpose is streamlining, which I think it is, and all the data that we have tell us that often, that languages of the past tend to be more complex, more complicated than they are now. Anyone who's ever looked at an Old English text will recognize this immediately. Not only can you not read it without training, for the most part, but you will see that it is, in terms of its morphology, its components, its syntax, it is a lot more complicated than modern English is. And it has 3 genders and so on and so forth. So this is a streamlining process. And just as languages can adapt to new concepts, all languages become more streamlined over time. As much as I might rail against it, there's nothing I can do. That's just the way it is. So even as I speak, modern English is changing. There are many other phenomena in modern American English that, for me, are technically ungrammatical, that I would never use and painful to listen to, frankly speaking, but they are part of the modern American English grammar. And, for example, there's no longer, first off, there are constructions don't really exist anymore, certainly not in the colloquial level. There are other things like subjunctive, which are far, far old, had died out a far longer time ago, and other things. One common expression is this "like" expression, like. It's typified as a Valley Girl manner, speech mannerism, but everyone uses it, even highly educated people. To me, it's, once again, anathema, but I understand its function. It's been studied. It's called the quotative "like," and it serves certain purposes. It serves the purposes of delineating certain things in communication. But whereas in a previous form of American English, you would use multiple words to achieve the same thing. For example, or for instance, is often substituted for with the word like. Many people say, and if I like do this, or if I like put the keys here, the following happens, instead of, and if, for example, or if, for instance, I were to do this. So what you have here with the like, this is one example of it, is a streamlining of processes that basically, like, in terms of its lexical function, semantic function, and to a lesser extent syntactic function, takes over multiple functions of multiple words and all into one. So you don't have just that. You have like as a substitute for reporting things. And he was like, as opposed to, and she said, or she implied, or what have you. So like here can take over the function of many different verbs, like, implied, etc. So yeah, this is once again a good example of streamlining. You have this one word taking over all functions, and it works. How do we know it works? Because the entire bloody country is speaking this way. And if you're outside of that selection pressure, for example, what if you are a foreigner who's learned English or acquired English only in school or much later on in life? This will seem rather odd. And to someone who is a native speaker, such as myself, but hasn't spent any amount of time there in eons, who grew up with a different standard set of rules, it seems rather odd to me too. Part of me, of course, given my background in the classics, is a bit prescriptivist. I think having rules, having a standard is very helpful, even if it doesn't actually match up with descriptivity or describing things. But nonetheless, that's how languages tend to work, much like organisms do. They respond to selection pressures, and in an effort to streamline themselves, I'm not describing conscious processes here, they just cut down on the baggage. This is almost universally so. We see it in the word like, we see it in syntactic phenomena such as there is versus there are, and we certainly see it in verbs. And on a final note, I mean, we're moving towards the end here. One classic example of this is agreement, the vast number of English verbs that we have been subject to what we call in linguistics leveling. That is, they've been leveled off. They were formerly what we call some people call irregular. That's not the right term, but we'll use it. Irregular verbs, such as I saw or I have seen, right? And they became regular over time. I mean, how many times these days do you see something such as the sun shined as opposed to the sun shone? The perfect example. We call this leveling. Specifically, we call this analogical leveling because the new form is a simplified form based on the most common form we have in English, which tends to be the ed, which is a plosive, right? The same can be said for some others that end in t, but for the most part, it is ed, and it is created because that's exactly what children do. They engage in analogical leveling too. They might say something like taked. Now, taked, took, as opposed to took. Take hasn't gone that far in the modern English lexis, but it's entirely possible that at some point in time people are going to say taked. Now, even for most of you, that sounds really bad, but maybe shined doesn't sound that bad when it sounds very bad to me. Maybe strived sounds okay to you, but I would invariably choose strove and striven, and so on and so forth. So what we have, and interestingly enough, strive originally was not a so-called irregular verb, but this is the only instance in history of a verb that became quote-unquote irregular due to analogical creation vis-a-vis other verb forms. So strive originally was in fact strive, strived, but people saw, drive, drove, driven, and thought, oh, it must be the same, so strive, strove, striven. Interesting little tidbit of knowledge there, a tidbit of linguistic history. So that is basically how language works. Let's just recap. Language is not thought. It is the filter. It is the final the final editor, if you will, of thoughts, but they're not synonymous. They just seem that way since it's the only way that we have the means of expressing what we consider thoughts. Languages, there is a distinct universality of languages, even if Paraha is true. You can see that a lot of this ultimately exists on a continuum of different gradations, whereas, for Paraha, it might be anything more than one is many, and for an English speaker, once we get to quadrillion, quintillion, sextillion, etc., that's where we trail off, and this is, in some ways, still universal. And there might be indeed degrees of recursivity or recursion in language. In the Paraha, it's been suggested don't have it at all, and based on their inability to count. And we all know that mathematics or mathematical forms are recursive. This could just be a lesser form of recursion, just like the continuum of counting might be expressed to lesser or greater degrees depending on how much exposure a language has. And finally, and the final two concepts, languages can develop. It's a question of exposure, and when they do, they innovate, they evolve, they respond to selection and pressure. And the final note, of course, is that languages streamline themselves unconsciously. People don't consciously do this. Nobody in the United States went out to say, today I'm going to get rid of copula agreement, and so all of a sudden say there's phones or there is phones as opposed to there are. This just happens as a natural process. People unconsciously, since they speak the language, engage in the minimalizing and the streamlining process, and most people are none the wiser. It's really only linguists who pay attention to these things. So anyway, I thought I covered some of the topics that Barbara brought up, not all of them, but then again, I wanted to focus on the things I knew the most about. And if there's interest in this sort of video, which to be honest, I highly doubt. If I'm not talking about women, usually there's very little interest. Then I am very pleased to make more videos of this sort, indeed more formal scripted videos. This video, of course, was not scripted. As always, thanks for watching, and everyone take care and enjoy the rest of your week. Bye-bye.